My name is Janice Fiamengo, and I'm a retired professor of English literature from the University of Ottawa, and I am now a men's issues advocate.
To Spokes. I'm Colette Golfer. In this episode, I talk to Janice Fiamengo. We chat about feminism, anti-feminism, about challenging dominant narratives about men, about the idea of the moral superiority of women, and more. This was a fascinating conversation for me, and I do think you'll enjoy it. It may challenge some of your ideas about men and women in the world today. If you are interested in hearing more from Janice, I'll put information in the show notes. The thing to follow is YouTube channel Steve Brule and the Fiamengo Files, but that's in the show notes. That's it for now. The big thing is on your Twitter profile, you describe yourself as an anti-feminist. So, of course, I have to ask you, why do you describe yourself as an anti-feminist?
Well, a lot of people would simply probably use a term like non-feminist or even modify feminist in some way. And as, for instance, Christina Hoff Sommers calls herself, I think, an equity feminist. I have lost confidence in the feminist label altogether, in the sense that I don't believe that there are any issues that modern feminists advocate for that actually have anything to do with justice or fairness or equality. So I just don't believe in the term anymore. Even the question for me of whether feminism was ever about equality is a really good question, because if you look back, I mean, most people think that the first waivers, the 19th century feminist activists who campaigned for the right to vote and for women to enter the professions, most people would say, oh, those were the good feminists. And then after that, feminism sort of lost its way. And although certainly one can, I think, agree that some of feminist advocacy had good aims, it always had this sort of man-blaming anti-male animus as part of its very fundamental reason for being. It blamed men for what it saw as the intolerably unjust situation of women. And I think any serious investigation of history shows that is simply not the case.
I was listening to one of the Fiamengo Files this morning, actually, when I was walking, and it was about the vote. Mm-hmm. And in 1916, that a lot of the men who were actually fighting didn't themselves have the right to vote.
Mm. And that's astounding to me that we don't know that. I myself spent years doing a PhD in English literature looking at late 19th century feminist advocates who journalists and essayists and novelists and part of what I was interested in as the historical context was the suffrage struggle, and I didn't know then that there were men who didn't have the right to vote. All of the literature I read completely ignored that. I mean, it was airbrushed out of the struggle at the time, certainly by those feminists, and it's been entirely eliminated from our historical knowledge of that period. And in fact, it's a really complex story, the right to vote. Waves of men of different classes, different races had to struggle to have the privilege of voting throughout the 19th century. I mean, up until the 1830s, very, very few men could vote. And even in the 1860s, the percentage of men who were able to vote it was certainly broadened, but it did not by any means encompass all men. And so we have this idea now that for centuries all men voted and denied the vote to women, and that is simply not the case. And and the other thing that's really important about the history of the suffrage struggle was that voting always had to do with reciprocal obligations on the part of men. Voting was understood to be a privilege, and it was granted to those who, in return, took up obligations on behalf of their country. And the major obligation was to defend one's country and, if necessary, die for it or be hideously maimed for it in time of war. And that is something that is still not widely recognized. And it's certainly something that no feminists, or at least none of the major feminists that I know about, are interested in advocating for women. When women got the right to vote, they never had to take up that reciprocal obligation. And I think that demonstrates a level of bad faith that is really appalling. And it's the thing about feminism from its beginnings that bothers me the most, that feminism has always been about shaking up the gender order and saying that women should not be confined in any way and railing against gender stereotypes. But it also relies on gender stereotypes. It relies on men's willingness to sacrifice for women, and it relies on men's deference and concern for women, and it doesn't acknowledge any of the sacrifices that men have made.
One of the ones that you mentioned in one of the files was about the Titanic.
Yeah.
That was it. Something like 75% of men died.
Yeah. I mean, if you look at those numbers, it's extraordinary. The number of men who were expected to die, and who did, and that was a part of the gender compact of that time. That men sacrifice for women. That isn't acknowledged. It's still the case today. I mean, if you look at who dies in dangerous, dirty, body hurting, body destroying work in our societies, it is overwhelmingly men. I think men are the ones who are injured and die on the job. Something like 95% is male. Still, of course, those who die in war are male. The number of homeless, it's something like 75% male. There's a prison sentencing gap that is 63%. The sentencing gap that favors women. Women are less likely to be charged for a crime. Women are far more likely to be able to get a plea deal. And if they are they're less likely to be convicted, but if they are actually convicted, their sentences are 63% less than men's for comparable crimes. In all sorts of ways, our society still favors women, still sees women as needing extra protections, and that's not recognized by feminists at all. And the idea that feminists are interested in gender equality, I think, is completely undermined by the fact of those gender discrepancies that feminists never talk about. There are moves right now in the UK, probably in Ireland as well, although I don't know about them, certainly in North America too, to decrease the number of women who go to prison for serious crimes, even up to and including murder, because of this notion that women who do bad things are always victims. That's the narrative that we hear. And the idea is that women are often either inducted into their life of crime through men, or they take up a life of crime because they were abused as children, they were abused by men, they were sexually abused, that kind of narrative, which is probably true in many cases, but it's true for men as well. Anybody who does a serious study of male criminality will find that most men who end up committing crimes, they were not privileged men. They were also abused. They often came from impoverished backgrounds. They were often encouraged to begin a life of crime by others, or even forced into it in some manner. But yet you don't hear very many people at all, including feminists, advocating for alternative forms of sentencing or talking about men as victims. So, that's the thing that bothers me so much about our contemporary discourse.
Yeah, it's very uneven. And I know one of the other figures is suicide. I think male suicide is much higher.
Yeah, all across the world, with very few exceptions, men commit suicide at rates 3.5 to 4, and depending sometimes on the age group you look at, but 3.5 to 4 times higher than women's suicide rate. And, there are complex reasons for why that is so, but the fact that it is so certainly raises a question about notions of male privilege. And, it's not usually the case that the privileged class is the class that kills itself more often. And, of course, there are other that has higher rates of addiction as well, higher rates of deaths of despair, for example, which are not quite the same as suicide, but where basically the person just allows themselves to die through their lifestyle because they just stop caring about themselves and abuse their bodies. And so, the fact that is so would certainly suggest that this notion that men live these lives of ease and privilege that they should apologize for, and that all our attention should be turned towards women's problems, it certainly raises questions about it. And yet if you see campaigns about suicide, there will often be a female face to the campaign, because we as a society, I think across the Western world, all English-speaking societies just tend to care more about women, and we have a lot of trouble caring about men's pain and men's suffering.
And why is that? Why do you think that is?
That's a really complicated question. People like there's a famous men's advocate named Warren Farrell, who wrote a book in the 1990s, early 1990s, called The Myth of Male Power. And he talks about that, and other men's advocates have given explanations. And a lot of people see it as having a kind of like psychobiological evolutionary origin, that societies value what is most immediately necessary for survival. So it makes sense to value women and to be concerned about their survival because of women's role in reproduction. And so a society that doesn't look after its women is going to be a society that doesn't survive for very long at all. So, that's part of the explanation, it seems. But of course, ultimately, a society that doesn't look after its men is also going to be a society that's in trouble. It's going to be vulnerable to attacks from outside, and it's going to become dysfunctional in various ways. So that's not the whole explanation, but it certainly seems to be the case that we all of us, both women and men, have a kind of preference for women and a greater sense of compassion for women. There's a couple of psychologists, I think Alice Eagley and Antonio Mladinich are their names, and they have found this. I think they coined a term called the women are wonderful effect, which is the tendency on the part of people observing the world to see women in more positive terms. We just tend to have more positive associations with women. There's also a psychologist named Roy Baumeister who has talked about this as well. Women tend to have a greater in-group preference, so that if they see a situation where a woman seems to be in trouble, or a woman is making a demand that something is wrong, that women will band together to advocate that something should be done about it. And men tend to respond very powerfully to that. And men will give money, for women's shelters, or to, any kind of program that advocates for women will be supported by men as well as by women. Whereas if you put a male face on whatever the charity is, or if you're trying to raise awareness about domestic violence that impacts that impacts men, and all the reputable studies show that yes, men can also be the victims of very severe domestic violence, and yet there are almost no shelters, no programs for men. In the United States, there's an act called the Violence Against Women Act that has channeled billions of dollars over the years into feminist organizations and into programs specifically for women. If you are a man who is being beaten by your female partner, or indeed by your male partner, and you're looking for help, it's highly unlikely that you'll be able to find any, even now, in 2020, and attempts to raise awareness about those kinds of issues, well, it's just not very successful. They're met with disbelief. Even worse, they're met with a kind of revulsion. Like there's something in both men and women. And again, this may have a psychobiological root, perhaps. That we want men to be strong. Those are the men that we want to look to, whereas weak women evoke our compassion. Weak men do not evoke our compassion. We turn our eyes away from those men. In fact, we often feel revulsion for them rather than empathy. So it's a big problem.
It's pretty extraordinary. I was thinking from the biological side of things, it does make sense, because if you have 100 men and one woman, over a lifetime, there'll only be, maybe 10 children. Mm-hmm. Whereas if you have 100 women and one man, you could have 1,000 children. So there's a biological...
That's it.
That makes sense biologically.
Yeah, exactly. Like just in terms of the time that goes into producing a child on the woman's part, the woman needs to be protected, obviously, for the 9 months that she's pregnant, and then, for some time after that when she is breastfeeding the child. So, her actual physical existence is important in a way that the man's physical existence is not to the same degree. Yeah, if you just look at the numbers in that sense. So there's a certain logic to the preference. Men's advocates often talk about it in terms of gynocentrism. We say that our society is woman-centered in that way, and that it has that kind of biological basis, and always has been to some degree or another. And much of what feminists now complain about, some of it rightly so, about restrictions that were placed on women in the past, those restrictions didn't spring from hatred for women, but from the desire and felt need to protect those women, and they were seen as fragile. Indeed, women were in many ways fragile. It's almost impossible, I think, for us to imagine what it was like up until really very recently, just a few generations ago, when, most women's lives were spent bearing and raising children. And, that was the focus. That took all of their physical capacity. And so, the idea that women should have been at the forefront of, I don't know what, technological innovation or as scholars or inventors or scientists. There were some, but most women were bearing and raising children. I've lost my train of thought there.
I'll jump in there very quickly then. Anna, I just want my grandmother on my mother's side had 16 children. Mm-hmm. So that was the norm in Ireland of that time.
Yeah.
So I think technology and contraceptives have allowed for a lot of the changes. I want to go back in time.
And one more thing I wanted to say about that too is just that when men could create technologies that lightened women's burdens, they did so. I mean, in the 19th century, men created all sorts of, domestic technology, washing machines and, all those kinds of things that made it possible for women to be, to some extent, freed from the burdens of looking after the household. And then, of course, contraception as well, although there were many debates and struggles over that. But by and large, men made it possible for women to be freed from many of the burdens that they had traditionally borne. And as soon as they did that, women began to enter the public sphere in all sorts of different ways. So the idea that, men, that there was animus against women and that women were held back because men hated them just doesn't seem to be borne out by the facts of history. There's a really interesting book, if anybody wants to read about it, by a British barrister and journalist named Belfort Bax, who wrote a book called, published, I think, now I'm going to forget the exact date, but it's something like 1908, around there. And he'd been writing in the late 19th century, he'd been writing articles in the 1880s and 1890s too. And the book is called The Fraud of Feminism. And there he objects to this idea that, that there is any kind of cultural bigotry against women. He makes the argument that it's the other way around, that men care deeply about women. And he even looks at cases of criminal sentencing and the way in which even then, in the late 19th century, it was much more difficult, for example, to have a woman convicted of murder than a man be so. And that women could use the defense that if they had murdered their husband, for example, they could use the defense that their husband was a brute and that, they murdered him in self-defense or simply because he was such a terrible person. That was a defense that was never used with any success by men who murdered their wives. And Bax's point is that always in the courthouse, there was an evident sympathy that could be generated for women that didn't exist for men. And the last thing I wanted to say about that too was that, I think the argument can be made that societies were always, to some extent, gynocentric, successful societies in the West, certainly for centuries and centuries. But in the past, there was a very clear distinction drawn between good women who deserved to be defended and protected, and bad women who were not deserving of those elaborate protections. What has happened now, to a certain degree, I think, is that we no longer can, as a society, we can't bear that notion that there should be any sort of distinction between good women who are contributing to the flourishing of their society and bad women. So we will simply no longer accept that there can be such a thing as female evil. We still accept, of course, that there is such a thing as male evil, and we know what forms it takes. It takes the forms of hyper-aggression, hyper-competitiveness, and violence. But we do not look at the forms that female evil can take. We, in fact, deny that there is such a thing as female evil. We see it's always as a result. We claim that it's always because a woman has been victimized. And I think that gets us into a lot of trouble. And it's created problems with, the Me Too movement, for example, in which we accept that if a woman simply says that something happened to her, that a man touched her, or a man harassed her, or a man assaulted her, that we should accept it. We can't bear the idea that there might be reasons why women would lie. We can't bear the notion that women actually might have malice toward men and might make things up in order to destroy that man. And that is a real problem in our society if we can't even talk about the possibility of female dishonesty, female culpability, female manipulativeness. And these are real issues that even to raise them is super dangerous for both men and women in the public sphere.
Yeah, and I have seen that myself. The idea that, well, you're meant to believe all women.
Yeah.
And I mean, I know from my own personal experience, no, I do not believe all women. And yet at the same time, how bizarrely difficult it can be to say that in public. Well, it's not difficult for you.
Yeah, but I don't have much. I'm not risking very much. I'm retired now. I had a pretty secure position for many years. I would certainly think twice about it if I had a different sort of position. If I were a broadcaster, if I were a teacher in the public school system. Just anything. You can get into serious trouble the moment you say something that angers women. They don't even necessarily have to be feminist women. As soon as a movement starts up to say that you have created an environment where women don't feel safe, you're in big trouble. You're accused of verbal violence. You're accused of making women uncomfortable, creating an environment where violence can be enacted towards them, and that's a firing offense in many cases, where it would be ludicrous to say the same about something a woman said about a man. I mean, just last year, there was a Egyptian feminist activist and author named Mona El-Tahawi. She lives in the United States now. She was touring all over the world, giving talks where she was, in a way, hypothetically advocating that women should enact vigilante violence against men in order to end rape, as she claimed. And, she made up these scenarios in which she said things like, what if we killed a certain number of men every week? At what point would the patriarchy finally sit down and say, okay, let's negotiate. What do you want us to do? And we'll do it. She had this bizarre idea that feminists have often proffered that, if the patriarchy, whatever that is, just wanted to, it could stop rape, as if men could do that if they wanted to. And, so she claimed she was not actually advocating violence, also, although she did certainly advocate it against any man who touches any woman. She herself claimed that she had beaten viciously a man who groped her at a nightclub, and she encouraged other women to do the same, basically saying women have carte blanche to attack men as long as they claim that the man touched them first. But she wasn't actually advocating that women murder men simply as a political statement, but she hypothesized about it. Now, I mean, that's just like, what kind of a society? And, this is a woman who, yes, she has been criticized, but she also has many, many admirers. She's been invited to speak, all across the world as a freedom fighter for women. And, she can do that. She doesn't have to worry that she's going to be jailed or killed or even fired for that. If we really lived in the kind of vicious patriarchy that she claims, well, she would be shut up immediately. And instead she is lauded and paid handsomely for her speaking engagements. And, it's just bizarre. And you can't imagine a man doing that, a man standing up on stage saying, what if we killed a certain number of women every week? At what point would women finally start to pay respect to men? The guy, that would be the end of his career, and rightly so. But women are given carte blanche to say all sorts of horrific things about men, and men by and large take it. And many men, in fact, support their right to do so and think that they're pointing out some important kind of truth. There was a woman, a professor at Northeastern University a couple years ago, who wrote article in the Washington Post called "Why Can't We Hate Men?" It was in 2017, I believe, just at the beginning of the Me Too movement. There's a big picture of Harvey Weinstein in the article. Why can't we hate men? And the answer was, well, we can and we should, because men are lousy. Men are responsible for all the terrible things in the world. Like, it was an incredibly crude, simple-minded article. And it then said at the end, hey, men, if you don't want us to hate you for all millennia and for the millennia of woe you have inflicted on us, well, this is what you need to do. As if men are really that bad, why would they listen to what a woman is demanding they do? But she demanded that they step away from the power, vote only for feminist women, step back, don't take major roles in your society, allow women to take over the reins of society, because as we all know, women are going to do a hell of a lot better job than men have ever done. I mean, it was just an outrageous. This is a professor of sociology and women's studies at Northeastern University. She's still in the classroom. Men have to take her courses knowing that that's her attitude towards men, that she not only hates them, but can happily admit and proclaim that she hates them and be applauded for it and get published in a major newspaper. I mean, I find that, and I don't know any feminist who protested that. She claimed she got hate mail. Oh, really? Oh, you poor thing. Why would you get hate mail for proclaiming your hatred of men? She claimed she got death threats and rape threats. Of course, she never produced any of them. But, and that's the classic feminist MO. You make these outrageous, hateful statements, and then you cry victim if you get any kind of angry pushback at all. Well, it's a pretty nice gig if you can get it, but it, to me, does not give evidence of a patriarchal, misogynistic society in which women are held down and men have all the power. It looks like the opposite to me.
I heard a cat. I heard a pussycat, a cat. On my podcast. It was a podcast.
It's not just that these articles are written, it's the amount of support. I'm aware of Mona El Tahawi. She came to Galway in Ireland over 10 years ago. Yeah.
Oh, really?
And I got a friend of mine to interview her for something I was recording at the time. And I was really interested in what she was saying. But now I do follow her on Twitter, and I find it hard to even, when I skim through it sometimes, it's the things that she comes out with, the levels, and how we come to the point where we don't see what's happening. Have you read or come across the Grievance Studies project?
You mean the one with Helen Pluckrose and I know the other two names.
And James Lindsay and Peter Boghossian.
Yeah, and Boghossian, right? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yes.
So in one of their papers, which was a hoax paper, it submitted to a feminist or a gender study journal, the proposal was that straight white men, or certainly white men, students, should sit on the room of the lecture hall with draped in chains to pay for their previous sins of the patriarchy, I suppose. Yeah. And it was accepted. Or it was under review. I just don't understand sometimes why people aren't questioning this stuff a little bit more.
I know.
But
it's amazing.
And speaking of which, I do want to track back a little bit in time too. You said that you did your PhD on journalism and women in journalism. And at the time, you yourself didn't question this idea of men and the vote and World War I. Mm-hmm. What changed for you? So were you yourself a feminist? Did you call yourself a feminist?
Oh, yes. Yeah, I definitely did. Yeah. I mean, I think it's very difficult to resist the indoctrination at university because it's just so widespread and you don't hear alternative voices. You simply don't. And I mean, feminism is, intersectional feminism, which also includes critical race theory and post-colonialism and various other, sorts of victims or grievance studies approaches. It is the reigning orthodoxy at university, has been for years and years. I mean, we're now starting to hear some dissent and some voices raised saying, wow, this stuff is crazy. As you say, it actually advocates collective punishment of certain groups of people, which we know never ends well and is just simply on the face of it. An intelligent 10-year-old could explain to you why it's a very bad idea and why it's so unjust. But we are actually advocating it. And just I will answer your question, but it jumped into my head when you were saying about this hoax paper about male students being forced to do these things to sort of repent of their forefathers' putative sins. I mean, there are actual professors. There's one at a Canadian university who has advocated that women should speak first in all university classrooms, and that men should only be allowed to speak once women have had a chance to answer the questions or raise their concerns or, make their contributions to the discussion. This was put forward a few years ago, at a discussion. She's at an Eastern Canadian university, I think in I can't remember now whether it's Nova Scotia or New Brunswick, called St. Mary's. And, she was met with a great rousing round of applause for this. And she actually said that she does practice this form of feminist affirmation because women are silenced and women are marginalized. So
I can probably guess what subject she teaches, but do you know?
I can't remember now. And you know what it is? No, it was surprising. I wish I could remember her name. I can't remember. She teaches in the business school there.
Okay, right.
Yeah, you'd think she'd be a sociologist or an art history specialist.
Humanities, I would have said,
somewhere in the humanities.
Yeah.
But no, the corruption has spread everywhere. It's right. There's nowhere that it has not taken hold. And so that's the thing, that these crazy ideas, when they're being advocated by extremely intelligent people, and young minds are receiving these ideas, I blame myself for not resisting and questioning it at the time. I wasn't even a young person. I did a master's degree and a PhD. By the time I finished, I was 28 or 29. I can't even remember. So I was hardly a child, but I don't know. It's hard to actually explain in some way the power of that indoctrination. But when everyone around you accepts it, some people maybe, are kind of quietly skeptical, but you don't hear voices robustly denouncing the hideous injustice and hatred of these ideologies. So you think, well, these people are smart and they seem like good people, and there's something extremely attractive about those ideologies too. There is.
And did you have favorite thinkers at the time?
Oh, I loved them all, and the more radical, the better. There's something so exhilarating about that conviction that you are advocating. You're part of a movement that is going to overthrow injustice, and you're going to create a whole new world where nobody is ever improperly treated. Of course, the fact that white men in particular are going to have to pay for that, for the alleged sins of their fathers, that doesn't strike you as wrong. But I liked all the feminists. Andrea Dworkin, who was a radical feminist from the late 1970s, 1980s. Catherine McKinnon, a very radical legal theorist. Robin Morgan. I found them all compelling. I loved their anger. I loved their conviction of righteousness. And, of course, it's very empowering for those who can see themselves as righteous victims in the schema that is being advocated. And, and the literal empowerment in the sense that you can speak out at rallies, in the classroom, in the public square. You can stand up and tell your story of victimization. You can make your demands. You can shame other people merely for the color of their skin or for their sex. And most people, the vast majority, will listen and will not speak back to you. The power of that is incredible. All you need are a few slogans and your personal story of how you have been oppressed. And you can go really far with that. And in fact, you can now get a degree on the basis of that. It's a very seductive kind of ideology. So, I went all in, I have to admit. And as I say, I was an adult. I went all in. I was very interested in it. I wrote my Feminist PhD thesis. And it was really only afterwards when I started teaching. I mean, I'd already, I think, to a certain extent started to question, but once I got my first full-time job, which was at the University of Saskatchewan, in 1999, by that point, I was in my early 30s, and that was when the whole thing started to look like a house of cards quite quickly, because I could just see that the young men in my classes were not privileged. They did not have an entitlement mentality. They were just, in fact, if anything, they were puzzled. They were hurt by this ideology. It had nothing to do with the way they had been brought up to behave, the way they lived their lives. And I just started thinking, well, wow, what a trip, to use that language, to put on these kids. These are 18, 19-year-olds, clean-cut guys. They've never done anything bad in their lives. They've never wanted to hurt a woman. They've never forced themselves sexually on a woman. And they're being told that because they're male, and especially if they were white, they are responsible for all the evil in the world. And the only thing they can do, a la that Professor Susanna Walters, who wrote the Why Can't We Hate Men, all they can do is step back, shut up, listen, echo feminist talking points, and allow their sisters, their moral superiors, to take over the world, and be thankful that that such superior moral beings exist to tell them about the errors of their ways. That was basically it. And I just thought, this is just crazy. And then as soon as I started kind of investigating, the lies of the whole movement just became apparent to me.
Okay, so the first step in you is seeing another perspective was teaching and relating to the students that were in front of you.
Yeah.
And then that led you to explore a bit. It wasn't that you came across a thinker that challenged you or in a discussion.
No.
So
not really.
you started to search out then.
Well, it took a long time. It was also just becoming aware of the obvious exaggerations and misrepresentations of feminist scholarship, because I was absolutely immersed in that world, and you read all of these papers, and as you yourself have already said, making these very extreme, hateful claims, the extremity of it, the hyperbole, and also the the lockstep thinking, nobody ever dissenting, the vision of the world so uniformly the same, all over and over again, the vision of the past, and seeing things like talking about the suffrage struggle and associated issues. Seeing claims made about how, for example, women being excluded from war was an example of patriarchal oppression of women. The blindness to it. The men are the ones being maimed and killed in order to protect the women, and yet you're saying that is an example of patriarchal oppression of women, and that those kinds of claims in every situation imaginable, even where the mangled, bloody bodies of the men are right there for all to see. Those claims are just made over and over again. It just struck me as obscene after a while. So for years then, I just dissented, and I began to, when I would review books of feminist criticism, for example, I would voice my dissent, although at that point I still kind of considered myself within the feminist camp. It really wasn't, it took me a long time. It really wasn't, I would say, until probably the fall of 2012. So this is years into my journey of skepticism. And at that point, this is a Canadian story, but the man that I mentioned earlier, Warren Farrell, this men's advocate, who also began as a feminist and finally gave up feminism because he couldn't ignore the anti-male hatred that was such a deep part of the movement. He came to the University of Toronto in the fall of 2012 to give a talk on his most recent book. He's done a lot of writing about boys' problems, the specific problems of boys in school. Christina Hoff Sommers has also written about this, the war against boys, the ways that the entire education system now is slanted against boys in order to advantage girls, again, under the assumption that it's girls that are marginalized by our society and whose confidence needs to be boosted and whose way of learning needs to be affirmed and that kind of thing. And so he was talking about all of the troubles with the very material consequences of boys, their dropout rates from school being so much higher than girls, far fewer boys, young men, are attending university, far fewer finish university. It's almost 60% female to 40% male at most universities now, and yet still the affirmative action measures keep going. We find all sorts of positions that are only open to women. I know that's happening in Ireland quite emphatically now. In the few places that still have a larger, like the few faculties, that still have a larger number of male students over female students, which are mainly the hard sciences and engineering, there's a very aggressive feminist drive to remedy that imbalance. And yet there are all sorts of other, the Faculty of Education, certainly the humanities, certainly the social sciences, health sciences, even law are now predominantly female. So he was talking about, some of those issues. And he was almost prevented from speaking. There was a huge demonstration against him. Crazed students. This was the beginning of really the movement of student aggression on campus to shut down speakers with which they thought they disagreed. I doubt that anybody had actually read Warren Farrell, but they were encouraged by their women's studies professors to prevent him from speaking. They blocked the doorways to the room where he was speaking. They tore down and defaced the posters advertising his talk. They shouted obscenities at the security that were brought in to try to keep order. And this was all caught on film by a friend of mine named Steve Brule. And I saw that. And I saw the fury on the faces of these young people who knew absolutely nothing about Warren Farrell or about the issues that he was going to talk about. He's an extremely gentle man. The idea that he's some kind of misogynist is just ludicrous. And at that point, I thought, wow, this has actually happened. This is the coming to fruition of the hatred and the lies about men that have been promulgated by feminist theorists for years. And at that point, I finally decided I should start doing something about it. So I tried to give a talk the following spring. March of 2013 was the first public talk that I was invited to give at the same University of Toronto. I did give the talk, but it was, again, heavily protested. The fire alarm was pulled, and
If it was heavily protested by that point, so what was the title, or so people were aware of your position at that point?
Well, I was a nobody really, still at that point. But the title of the talk was "What's Equality Got to Do with It?" And I forget what the subtitle was, but it made very clear that it was going to be a talk that contested the claims of feminism, and that tried to make the argument that in fact it was young men on college campuses today who are being silenced and harassed and marginalized. And right around the same time, there'd been a lot of attempts by young men to start men's issues awareness groups, where young men could get together and talk about what it was like to be a young man in the world today, in the post-feminist world. And that in itself was considered beyond the pale by feminist activists on campus. I mean, that's the degree of their certainty, that they don't even want young men to be able to talk about men's issues outside of a feminist framework. These feminist activists demanded, well, they prevented these men from being able to form these groups unless they would explicitly adopt a feminist framework. So they could talk about men's issues like suicide and homelessness and fatherlessness and, various things, but they could only talk about them within a perspective that essentially blamed men and patriarchy for causing those problems. And so this was happening all across North American campuses, and that was one of the focal points of my talk, but that was considered, dangerous.
Yes. So did your talk actually go ahead
It
then?
did go ahead finally, yeah.
And did people, when you say finally, it was stopped a few times? Or?
Well, the fire alarm was pulled just when I was about to start. And so we all had to leave, and then we had to wait for the fire marshal to declare that there was no fire. And then we came back in, and there was, a lot of heckling, and there was
sorry, where was that again?
That was at the University of Toronto.
Okay,
yeah.
And were you working there at that point?
No, I was at the University of Ottawa at that point, but I did the following year attempt to give a talk at the University of Ottawa. That one kind of went ahead, but the fire alarm was also pulled there a couple of times, and they prevented me from speaking. They banged drums and played horns and sang the Communist Internationale at that one. And yeah, I've had many. I've tried to speak at the Ottawa Public Library. I've been prevented by an Antifa affiliate group, and I joined up with a group called the Canadian Association for Equality, which is a group that tries to advocate for men's issues. And I was especially interested at that point in just being a resource for any young man at college who wanted to come and talk about the troubles he was having, or even just his frustrations. And so I joined the Canadian Association for Equality, and we put on all sorts of events featuring speakers, some of them even calling themselves feminists. We invited Kathy Young, who calls herself an equity feminist but is critical of feminism. We invited her to speak. Paul Nathanson, who's written a series of books about cultural misandry, we invited him to speak. We invited various people, and all of them were protested, sometimes hysterically. So we had a lot of trouble. The concerted effort to prevent any alternative voice from being heard on a college campus, it goes, it's been very, very aggressive for the last 10 years or so.
And you said that you kind of set yourself up as a focal point for young men who did want advice. So did many come to you?
Not so many in person, although certainly some did. But from the time I gave my first talk, I began to be flooded with email messages from young men. Well, not just young men, older men too, but from university men for sure. And just other men whose lives have been turned upside down by various encounters with the feminist establishment, whether it's men who lost everything, including access to their children following a divorce, or men who were falsely accused of something and lost their jobs, or were accused even of maybe they did it, like talking to a girl at work that they liked. And then she went and told the boss that she'd been made to feel uncomfortable, and the guy lost his job over that, things like that. I mean, I heard from so many men, and that was really the beginning of my life as an advocate. I had no idea. I began as a skeptic of feminist claims, but I had no idea that so many men's lives had been impacted, and not in the way feminists say. Feminists always say, oh yeah, it's when you're used to being so privileged, it's difficult not to be privileged anymore. No. We're not talking about that. We're not talking about mild discomfort, psychological readjustments that are having to take place. We're talking about men's lives, their ability to earn a living, their ability to hold their head up in society, their ability to see the children that they love. I mean, we're talking about men's lives absolutely ruined. And what the thing that struck me was that so many of them, they still, like, there's far from the stereotype of the aggressive, entitled man, contemptuous of women or whatever, the stereotype that feminists have of the average man. They weren't like that. All they wanted was to work with women in harmony, to work with women, to have a loving relationship with a woman in their personal lives. They were happy to work with women in their, professional lives. And it just seemed that they had no rights at all to an alternative point of view, or to allege their innocence if they had been accused of something. I was overwhelmed both by the injustice that the various injustices that they had experienced, and by their continuing goodwill. The vast majority weren't even angry at women overall. They were just bewildered and devastated by the things that had happened to them.
There have been similar stories in Ireland, and I know of one young, brilliantly talented man whose career was almost completely destroyed by a group of feminists who targeted him very publicly in a public letter with hundreds of signatories, and also claim he's trying to move away from that. So I'm not even going to mention his name. Yeah. He's super talented, and I hope that he's eventually going to be able to come back and talk about it. But and also I've seen cases of women where a man might ask them out or invite them up to a bedroom, and suddenly his career is going to be destroyed. Yeah. It's like, I'm conscious of time. I could keep talking to you for hours, honestly. But I do want to ask you very quickly. You did mention Ireland. I am in Ireland. Are you aware of much of what's going on in Ireland yourself? Have you heard of anything? Have you been in contact with people from Ireland?
I do get letters from Irish men, and certainly the one issue that I'm really aware of is that there is a very strong move going on in a number of Irish universities to have women-only positions, because there is certainly this notion that women have been held back, for centuries, and now at last it is women's time, and so we're going to create all these professorships that are only available to women. And that's, that's all. We could spend an hour just talking about that. This notion that we're going to make a generation or more. I mean, certainly that kind of hiring's been going on, maybe not quite that officially. It's been going on in Canada and the United States for decades. It creates all sorts of problems. Inevitably, of course, it creates resentment on the part of the men who are excluded from those positions, understandably so, but it creates a lot of problems for the women who are hired into them as well. That's just one of the things, really. I mean, I don't have my finger on the pulse of what's going on in Ireland any further than that. But I expect that in many ways, a lot of the issues are very similar. The point you make about the power of a woman's word to destroy a man's life. I have heard from so many men who have had that happen to them, and the viciousness of these women, the willingness to have a man disgraced forever and to lose his employment. And often it's clear from what the women have to say about him that he irritated them. That's it. He was either overly persistent in trying to ask them out on a date, or he committed some very mild act of indiscretion. We're not talking about rape, while they were both drunk. And that is enough to, bring down all the forces of social disapproval and penalty upon him. And unfortunately, many employers are willing to accept even an anonymous letter claiming that so-and-so is a danger to women because this is what he has allegedly done, and without any due process, certainly without any presumption of innocence or any proper investigation, the man can lose his job. It's incredible.
Hopefully things will. Well, they have to change. Things are always changing anyway. I also I have a little boy, and I think that in schools there's almost a pressure on little boys to not behave as little boys.
Exactly. Yeah.
I see that happening as well. Yeah. So for people who have sons or husbands, fathers, brothers, guys that we love in our lives, it's concerning, I think.
Yeah. Well, and that's that is going to be the thing that will change it. And I mean, I would love to see marches organized across the world on a certain day that could be chosen. And the marches would be called Not in My Name, and they would be women and families advocating for men and against feminism. And we need to have way more women. They don't have to, be men's rights activists or anything. That just standing up and saying, I don't want this done to my son. I mean, and I think mothers of sons in particular have the moral power to say that. I don't want this done to my son in the name of feminism. That'll be what it will take for this incredibly powerful cultural movement to get turned around.
Talk to me, talk to you, talk to me.
That's it for this episode of Spokes, with thanks to Janice Fiamengo for joining me. Don't forget to subscribe to Spokes and check out our other episodes.
Spokes is produced by Colette Colfer and Terry Hackett.